Ireland, and prior to moving to England in 1987 to study law, he had a number of careers, including playing professional soccer, and then something tells me he's in a love-hate relationship with Manchester United and Manchester City, and just doesn't know what to do with that. He practices criminal and human rights law, including offenses under the Anti-Terrorism Act. He was appointed by the Pentagon as a foreign attorney consultant to Guantanamo Bay from 2004 to 2011 to participate in the military commission trial process in defending a particular young Canadian detainee named Omar Khader. Any of you who've been watching the news at all over the last couple of years, you'll know that Dennis and his wife have taken a particular interest in what justice looks like in that case. Mr. Edney is counsel in various reported cases, including landmark cases before the Supreme Court here in Canada and the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2008, he was awarded the Canadian National Pro Bono Distinguished Service Award, recognizing the significance of his commitment to defending Khader. I had the incredible privilege of sharing a meal with Dennis a number of months ago when I happened to be up in Edmonton for work, and found out that we are both former seminarians, and that we're both drawn to this world of human justice and what that means. And actually, I want to say that I was on the cusp of working through a justice issue personally, internally at that time, and couldn't resist after being challenged by one of Dennis's stories to actually take action on that, and did something that actually might have had some career limiting consequences, but I couldn't say no anymore. I had to act. And so, Dennis, I want to say personally, thank you for who you are and how you challenged me. And I want to welcome you to the podium today to share with us ADR and beyond, the rule of law, and an age of fear. Welcome, Dennis.
So thank you for inviting me here today. I know nothing about mediation. I know everything about fighting. I also like to recognize a lawyer, John Norton, who's here today. I haven't seen John in years. When I was a law student, John was a sort of co-principal that I had to go before and work in his office for a while. So it's lovely to see you, John. The title of my talk here is The Rule of Law in an Age of Fear. I will touch upon a number of themes, and hopefully by the end of my talk, I will have challenged you to question whether the concept and the practice of justice is being carried out in your name. It is an accepted fact that the world today faces great challenges to the rule of law and human rights. Previously well-established and accepted legal principles are now being called into question in all regions of the world through what I would suggest are ill-conceived responses to terrorism. Many of the achievements in the legal protection of human rights are under attack. Now, terrorism certainly poses a serious threat to human rights, and all countries have an obligation to take effective measures against acts of terrorism. Under international law, all governments have both a right and a duty to protect the security of all its citizens. However, since September of 2001, many countries have adopted new counter-terrorism measures that are in breach of their international obligations. In fact, in some countries, the post-9/11 climate of fear and insecurity has been exploited to justify long-standing human rights violations carried out in the name of national security. And this has led to an intense debate over where the balance lies between the rule of law, human rights and civil liberties on the one hand, and security on the other. Former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, on leaving office, described what she felt was the appropriate or preferred balance. She stated, "We have found through experience around the world that the best way to defeat terrorists is to increase law enforcement capabilities while at the same time promoting democracy and human rights." Now these remarks would have struck many Western liberal audiences at the time as mainstream beliefs consistent with the rule of law and reflective of values which we prided ourselves off at that time. However, over the years, many Western democracies since 9/11 have reappraised the balance described by Madame Albright and exploited the climate of insecurity and have embarked upon what I describe as a politics of fear to limit civil liberties. Take, for example, that the American National Security Agency, the NSA, has been accused of overstepping its boundaries in recent years. Its activities are not simply confined to eavesdropping on terrorists and potential security risks, or the heads of states and other powerful figures. It has spied on the everyday life of American citizens, capturing billions if not trillions of communications as it probes deeper and deeper into their private life. Meanwhile, in Canada, the 2015 Anti-Terrorism Act provides new powers to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service CSIS that fails to respect the safety and the privacy of Canadians. Instead of putting forward concrete measures to make Canadians safe and to protect our freedoms, parliamentarians have put politics over principle and have introduced a bill that is both sweeping, it's dangerously vague, and it's likely ineffective. For example, the legislation allows for unprecedented and excessive powers to CSIS to collect and share extensive personal information and details without your knowledge, to permit Canadian citizens to be detained without due process, to place individuals on a no-fly list without notice or explanation, and all without convincing mechanisms to ensure that these powers are not misused. Under the cloud of exaggerated fear about the nature and the scope of the terrorism threat, we have now turned our domestic spy agency into something that looks disturbingly like a secret police force. And there are those who view this legislation as an inversion of the judiciary's role as a protector of our constitutional rights and a violation of judicial independence from government. Now, amongst the various explanations provided by the former Canadian government for these unconstrained powers was this comment from the Prime Minister's office that, and I quote, "Judges have constrained the agency's powers in the name of civil liberties." The view that the judiciary is an obstacle to public safety is not a novel one. In fact, the Bush administration, in setting out its national defense strategy in 2005, warned Americans, and I quote, "Our strength as a nation will continue to be challenged by those who employ a strategy of the weak, by using international media and judicial processes." And similarly, in Britain's former Prime Minister Tony Blair, on the point of leaving office, stated that, and I quote, "It is a dangerous misjudgment to put civil liberties first, to do so was both misguided and wrong. Now these comments by Western leaders past and present are alluringly simple constructions of a subject matter that touches upon the very nature of the civil society we all wish to live in. And their comments are also fundamentally wrong. In adopting measures aimed at suppressing acts of terrorism, it's not simply a utilitarian calculation of security at the expense of civil liberties, or balancing the right to the security of many against the legal rights of the few. We are fighting for more than the safety of our citizens, as an important objective as that is. We're also fighting for the preservation of our democratic way of life, our right to freedom of thought and expression, and our commitment to the rule of law. Those liberties which have been hard-won over the centuries and which we should hold dear. In our commitment to the rule of law, we cannot compromise on long-standing principles of justice and liberty. And I say this because it is only by adhering to the rule of law are we ever able to define the boundaries of permissible and legitimate state action. And to those who would place security at the expense of civil liberties, they could have benefited from the words of the former US Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. And he said, "There is considerably less to be proud about and a good deal to be embarrassed about when one reflects on the shabby treatment civil liberties have received in the United States during times of war and perceived threats to national security. After each security crisis ended, the United States has remorsefully realized the abrogation of civil liberties was unnecessary. But it has proven unable to prevent itself from repeating the error when the next crisis comes along." Now, I've used the word terrorist today for the sake of simplicity, but it isn't a particularly useful term because it provides very little guidance. The international community itself has no single definition of what constitutes a terrorist group. It needlessly frightens people without informing them of anything important. There's no clear-cut and comprehensive definition of terrorism in international criminal law. And governments have used the term subjectively for their own policy objectives over the years. And politicians employ it to justify illiberal measures. And the panic it provokes ramps up prejudice against minorities. It is even used to win support for war. I suggest it is one of the most toxic words of our time, because we are strongest when we truly understand the problem and respond in a calm and thoughtful manner to the facts that we know are true. If one considers that since 1980, when former President Jimmy Carter declared the Persian Gulf a vital interest, the United States had bombed, invaded, and or occupied pretty well every country from Pakistan to Libya, 14 in all, often uninformed by either history or geographic reality. The legacy of Western colonialism in the Middle East since 1919 by the French and in Great Britain left many scars that have not been forgotten today. And artificial borders that were drawn by the Europeans have left a legacy of unresolved ethnic, ideological, and religious issues. And this enmity has been exacerbated by the Western military intervention in Iraq in 2003 with the consequences that we face today. Unfortunately, we did not understand our history in 2003 and still don't understand it today. Since 9/11 then, Muslims have been made to pay a terrible price for the actions of 19 fanatics who in no way represented Islam or its values. Afghanistan and Iraq were bombed and invaded as a direct consequence of 9/11. Over 1 million men, women and children have been killed in these countries. Untold numbers maimed, widowed and orphaned. Our actions continue to alienate Muslims everywhere. So it would not be naive to think that others may consider that we are the terrorists and that they are the victims, and with good reason. But meanwhile, the phrase war on terror and terrorist has now become synonymous with Islam and Muslims in the minds of many of us. We have bought into the phrase war on terror. It is an inaccurate term, I suggest, a rhetorical device, a cynical manipulation of the public's horror after 9/11. The phrase war on terror has no more legal authority or practical meaning than would a war on cancer or a war on poverty. But as a result, it's easy for us to accept drastic measures must be taken in the interest of security, even if it means the suspension of civil liberties, compromising our values, or ignore the rule of law. We rationalize, it's for the greater good of society. Can any of us now state with any conviction that we have become a more stable world, a more tolerant and compassionate society since 2001? The reality is that public anxiety has increased along with intolerance, discrimination, and bigotry. Since 2013, the overall number of reported hated crimes against religious groups fell in Canada, except for Muslims, who experienced a 44% increase according to Statistics Canada. One has to look no further than Guantanamo Bay to understand how easy it is for a nation, any nation, to fall into lawlessness when we don't get that balance right between security and civil liberties. Guantanamo has been called everything from an offshore concentration camp to a legal black hole. It is a complex of gulags, of brutal prisons, where hundreds of men and youths, like Omar, from all over the world, have been held by the US government under incredibly inhuman conditions and incessant interrogations. And I say to you, it has tarnished all our reputation, every single one of you here today. How can we consider ourselves as a civil society committed to the rule of law while we remain silent about Guantanamo Bay and all it stands for? And these descriptors should come as no surprise to anyone, because it was in January of 2002 we witnessed the first shocking images of detainees hooded and shackled for transportation across the Atlantic to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, much as other human beings had been carried in slave ships 400 years earlier. And on their arrival in Guantanamo Bay, we witnessed the humiliation of these enormous human beings, unloaded on the tarmac like so much human baggage, then to be transported to open-air wire cages that would be their home for years, all without access to family, friends, lawyers, human rights organizations, or any semblance of due process or judicial oversight. And photos that we observed of detainees in orange jumpsuits, crouched in open cages, cuffed, hooded and masked, while kneeling at the feet of US soldiers in those wire cages, you recall, is emblematic of how the US intended to fight its war on terror. And for the watching world, which is you and I, no knowledge of international humanitarian conventions was needed to understand that what we were witnessing was unlawful. This was not a manifestation of the Geneva Conventions at work, nor was it an act of deportation or extradition. It was far, far worse. It was the unlawful transportation to a world outside the reach of law and intended to remain so. And in that world, crimes against humanity were to be carried out. For what it stands for, I would never have envisaged that the history of the new century would encompass the collapse of moral order, the destruction and the distortion of fundamental legal and constitutional principles that have been in place since the 17th century. We appear to have forgotten the lessons of the 17th century Star Chamber, where the accused was submitted to torture, to accusations based on secret evidence, held by a secret court, while being shackled in extremes of isolation. And the worst excesses of the past year, since 2001, should have sounded loud alarms to all of us, and not the least because of that precise historic parallel to the Star Chamber. We are now witnesses to habeas corpus being abandoned, secret courts being created to hear secret evidence. I've spent years in and out of secret courts. Guilt inferred by association, torture and rendition nakedly justified, and vital international conventions consolidated in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Geneva Conventions, the Refugee Conventions, the Torture Convention, and many more, have been deliberately avoided or ignored in the war on terror by Western governments, including our own. And I was into this hellish world. A young Canadian boy, Omar Khader, was simply abandoned. And to those who may not know the background, I'll be brief. He was 15 years old when his father left him in a compound in Afghanistan, controlled by half a dozen or so Taliban fighters. And the father promised to return and pick him up, but he never did. And US soldiers on patrol came knocking on the door of the compound demanding entry. And a firefight ensued, resulting in an aerial bombardment that destroyed the compound and killing most of the inhabitants. Then Delta Force soldiers then went into the compound to mop up any survivors. And a particular Delta Force soldier who gave evidence at Omar's trial in Guantanamo said that he saw Omar away from the battlefield, facing a blank wall, screaming from his shrapnel injuries, and he then just shot him twice in the back. That act in itself is a war crime. And miraculously, Omar Khader survived, the sole survivor. He was eventually loaded onto a military helicopter, and 7 days later, he regained consciousness in the background hospital. And on awakening in that hospital, little did Omar know that his troubles had only begun. Omar spent 3 months in the background hospital where he endured the anguish of the death. From the moment he gained consciousness, he experienced conduct that can only be described as sadistic, blatant and wanton criminal abuses. From the outset, or at the outset, Omar was unable to walk due to his injuries, and so as a result, his interrogations would take place at his bedside. His hands and feet would be shackled to the bed and all pain medication withdrawn in readying him for his torturers. And in Guantanamo, I've been going to Guantanamo for years, and one of the very, very few people, I'm the real animal doing that. Military personnel only stay 3 months in Guantanamo. I've been in Guantanamo at least 35 times over 10 years. And so they have different names for torture. And interrogations is not one of them, it's interviews. And when Omar's interrogators did not like his answers, his body would be then placed into stress positions, causing agonizing pain, reducing him into tears and screaming. At that time, he was damaged eyes, smashed right shoulder, partly paralyzed here, and 2 bullet wounds in his back, and all kinds of injuries. And 7 months after coming off that battlefield, what do? As soon as he wakes up, we put him in these stress positions, causing tremendous pain and anguish. And then, when he put him into these positions, what they would also do was use these pencil lights to shine directly into his damaged eyes, causing him to scream in agony. And today, Omar is blind in one eye and going blind completely in the other. And many nights, Omar lay in the hospital bed listening to the persistent screaming from other detainees during their own interrogations. I recall speaking to former British detainees about Omar, and they said they could hear him sobbing and screaming at night time in his bed. But they couldn't do anything, because if they did, they would suffer punishment. And as Omar became more mobile, he would be taken into an interrogation room where he would be beaten, waterboarded, and threatened with snarling dogs, all the while with a hood placed over his head, and that would be wrapped so tightly around his neck that he would choke and start to suffocate and panic, which was the intention in the first place. But he also endured something which I think was particularly significant, and what I describe as the crucifixion. Or as a US soldier who gave evidence at the trial said, and he's a former army man, and what he said was that he found Khader chained to the door frame of a 5-foot square wire cage on a wall, naked, with his arms suspended above his shoulders, hooded and weeping. I once showed that photograph to a public audience. It was so disturbing that I've never shown it since. And he'd be left hanging up in a crucifixion pose on that wire mesh for hours at a time. And then when he would need to pee and he would urinate on himself, that was the signal for his interrogators to take him down and use his body as a mop to clean up the pee. And then they would carry out various sexual perversions on him. Omar tells the story of a particular soldier who would regularly stop by his bed every day. He would drop his pants and stick his bum in his face and fart. Meanwhile, others standing by would just simply laugh, think it was funny. The unspoken shame carried by former Guantanamo detainees is the fact that we never discussed that systemic sexual abuse was used to break down the willpower of detainees. Damien Corsetti, whom you could see on CBC, and get his name in Dawson, and he was one of the interrogators dealing with Omar Khader at the hospital. And you'll see him on the television saying, "We did terrible things to that child." And saying to you goes against the very core of humanity, that torture and abuse would take place in a sacred place, such as a hospital, where people are at their most vulnerable. And where were the voices of protest from military personnel of all stripes who worked there? How were they able to suspend their moral and ethical compass to engage in such barbaric and sadistic acts towards anyone, particularly a child? In preparing for Omar's release into my home, I recently contacted some former detainees from Guantanamo Bay. One is now a human rights lawyer, the other is a human rights activist, and I inquired what I could expect. One of them said, "You know, Dennis, I trust you, so I'll tell you. At night time, when I put my kids to bed, it's dark, it's late, it's a tough time for me. I go into my car and I drive up the road, and I start screaming. Another detainee says to me when I meet, and I'll be meeting in a few weeks, said, you know, when you see, I can't talk very well, but my nose got smashed in by a guard. And you can see that I can't see it this side because another guard stuck his finger through my eye. And he said, you know, we were only in Guantanamo for 4 years. Our government asked for me to be returned, and we were returned. Omar was there for 10 years. And the interrogation team that tortured Omar in the Bagram hospital was supervised by Joshua Claus. He acknowledged he had interrogated Omar 20 to 25 times over a 3-month period, for up to 6 hours at a time. And I think to irritate me while I was cross-examining him, he said he may have been more robust with Omar than with others, meaning adults. And that says something, because Joshua Claus was later convicted by the US military for killing 1 detainee and crippling 2 others using the same techniques that he used on Omar Khader. And in a twist that Kafka would have relished, Claus was then granted immunity by the military prosecutors in exchange for testifying at trial that he had tortured Omar Khader into confessing he had thrown a hand grenade and killed a Delta Force soldier. And that evidence was relied upon in that kangaroo court by the military judge without the slightest regard of how this confession was made or any concern as to his physical or psychological condition at the time. In fact, Claus was treated as a hero both inside and outside the courtroom. There were simply no boundaries to the human rights violations carried out on Omar and other detainees. Organizations such as the International Red Cross, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reported such violations were standard procedure, including physical and sexual abuse, torture, rape and murder. And meanwhile, various representatives of either the Liberal government or the Conservative government persisted in telling you, the Canadian public, that they had been assured Omar was being treated humanely and would take the United States at his word, while other Western countries were less accepting, and he demanded the return of their citizens, adults, every one of them, and was granted. So as I conclude, our generation has had the most sophisticated development of international laws, treaties and conventions the international community has ever known, and all stating that human rights abuses will not be tolerated. And these international instruments include, as some have repeated, the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and many more, all applicable to Omar Khader and all denied to him. And as a result, the international consensus reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter of the United Nations that no one in the future would fall outside the protection of the law has been overridden and supplanted by lawlessness. And as a signatory to all these international treaties, Canada has a legal obligation to protest when they are not being applied to one of its citizens, and yet it has refused to uphold its human rights obligations to a 15-year-old child. And by its actions has demonstrated a shocking, a reckless, and a ruthless disregard for those moral and legal laws that give effect to the idea of fairness. And by doing so, it says something to each and every one of you here today. It shows how fragile are the laws and their application that each one of us assume are there to protect us and our children when faced with a government determined to follow a contrary path. History tells us that there are some cases that enshrine the defining moments of the time. Omar Khader's case is one. Future generations will rightly judge our shocking dereliction of responsibility in this matter and our collective failure to extend justice and humanity. And as we have failed Omar, we've also failed our children through bequeathing to them an uncertain future as a result of systemic apathy by its citizens and its civil institutions. So embedded in my talk tonight, or today I should say, has been the responsibility, the imperative for each and every one of us to stand up against injustice. Our responsibility as human beings, as I suggest, is to speak out to the reality of inhumanity and to speak out against the moral hollowness of political inaction. The only crime, in my view, equal to willful inhumanity is the crime of indifference, silence, and forgetting. Thank you very much.
Dennis, I'd like to say that in addition to thanks, I think what we just experienced here in terms of outpouring of appreciation is a recognition that within each of us lies that same broken human condition that you had both the privilege and the horror to experience firsthand in places like Guantanamo. And so it's a recognition that within us lives that element. And that also within us lies the capacity, I think you stirred the challenge to breaking some of that human condition and recognizing that as a community of professionals dedicated to creating options to Canadians and Canadian businesses, options of access to justice and real justice in its most humane form, you brought us to the place of recognizing that we need to step up to that challenge. So thank you for that. So as a token, a small token of appreciation, we want to extend our thanks to you, to the work you've done globally, and the work you've done to inspire us here today. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you very much.